Okay, good morning, everybody. Hi. Sorry, I'm starting a little late. Thanks for coming in. Hope you had a great weekend. We'll start off just by revisiting your assignment since the deadline's coming up. It should be, I think that's next Monday. I told you not to think about it, and now I want you to think about it. Sorry, you have to start thinking about it. Please make sure that you have your diagrams printed out and ready to pin up for next Monday. I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the assignment in more detail since I think I kind of skipped it on purpose. So hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at what we're asking you to do. There's a nice little blurb up at the front here that ChatGPT helped me write about axonometrics and diagrams. So definitely take a look at that. It's a rich text. There's some interesting, fun textual differences between different types of diagrams. I didn't know the difference between those things until the past year or two. So you don't need to know the difference in these terms. They're not things you're ever going to hear in your life. But they are just kind of helpful tools for helping you put together or decide what you're going to start to draw for your assignment. So part one of this assignment is going to be one 11 by 17 page of diagrams. So the first kind of thing that we're asking you to do is to choose kind of one of these ChatGPT categories and start to produce some diagrams for it. So we've split it up into analytical diagrams. So types of diagrams that are studying like a specific phenomena or happening in your building or your site or the architectural object you're interested in. So good examples of this are like a kind of topographic diagram or a circulation diagram. That's a very common type of drawing that you'll see in architectural practice, as well as anything like sun paths or program, just anything that's kind of like studying a specific aspect of a site or a program or a place in a kind of consistent way. We'll show you some examples of what that looks like in one sec. Another option is sequential diagrams. So that's something that's showing kind of maybe one element or one place, but across time or across scales. So I've got some examples of that as well. But basically, you just get to kind of choose what you're interested in. We're asking for kind of like a minimum of 3 kinds of either 3 distinct analytical diagrams or just kind of 3 phases of a sequential diagram. So hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense in a second. But basically, if you're doing something like a circulation diagram or a program diagram, just make sure that you have 3 of those so that we can look at kind of 3 different aspects moving across your site or working with your studio project. But if you're doing a sequential diagram, so something maybe something that's changing over time or something that's growing or shrinking, just make sure you have at least kind of 3 little moments to look at for this 11 by 17 diagram. So we're just asking for kind of like a minimum amount of consideration, a minimum kind of number of phases. So if you've got a circulation diagram, a sun path diagram, and a program diagram, like these bullet point examples here, then you're good to go. We're just asking for 3 kind of pieces, ideally from the same or a consistent viewpoint. So it's really easy to kind of compare and contrast across those different elements that you're studying. Or down here, if you're choosing to do a sequential diagram instead, maybe you have one diagram that's showing the site 100 years ago, one that's showing the site right now, and then one that's showing it 100 years in the future. So we're just asking for kind of like a minimum number of kind of moves or diagrams to consider. So that's all on one 11 by 17 sheet of paper. So please format it so it's legible, ideally something that's like kind of clear to read if it's pinned up on the wall. So definitely pay attention to line weights and making sure that it is clear and easy to understand what you're trying to present. There's some extra little hot tips in here. So that's step one. That's one 11 by 17 sheet of paper of diagrams. Step two is an axonometric. So that's a second 11 by 17 page that we're hoping you'll be able to print out and bring to class next Monday. And there's almost no rules for this one. We're just asking that you draw an axonometric of some kind. This can still be a diagram. Your previous diagrams can be in an axonometric view. That's great. But you're also welcome to explore more kind of artistic representational styles. I'll show you a couple examples of like a more zoomed out kind of like site plan type of axonometric or an exploded axonometric. Those are all really fun things to play around with for this assignment. So nothing too serious. I don't have any amazing examples to show you because we've changed this assignment a lot this year. But I will show you some examples of slightly different diagrams that we had students do last year, just to kind of give you an example of what diagrams might start to look like if they're not this specific kind of Bjark Ingels style of diagram. Although this is very welcome for this assignment. So again, if you're struggling to understand what you might start to study or draw for this assignment, definitely take a little Google for Bjark Ingels group diagrams. There's lots of, they're very well known for their classic diagram style. You can see that they use a very consistent axonometric viewpoint to study the same place through time or study design moves made to a specific site. So definitely check this out if you're feeling a little bit lost or confused. They've got some really great examples about using a consistent viewpoint for a diagram. I'll show you some student examples from last year that are kind of relevant, but aren't perfectly one-to-one translating. Does anybody have any questions or is the assignment clear enough? Yes, yeah. No, absolutely not. No, feel free to drop by hand if that's your vibe. There's no rules or regulations on what you use to produce these drawings. We just want you to make nice drawings. So whatever floats your boat. Great question. Any other questions about the assignment? Does it make sense? Okay, I'll like lurk around after class afterwards, just in case you have any more questions. But I'll show you a couple more, a couple student examples here. So I've labeled them high and medium. So some of these are like very strong. We had students last year who had like a 4-year degree in architecture that were playing in the sandbox with us. So some of these are kind of more than we would expect from you. But this is an example of what we had them do last year. So they were studying kind of material life cycles for a specific material they were using in their studio project. We've since moved away from this because they did not appreciate having to do material research for this class. So totally understandable. We're not making you do that anymore. Essentially, this is a really great example of using both kind of an axonometric viewpoint. So using this like really consistent axo view for all of these little icons or little sub diagrams that she's drawn here. And then mixing that with a more kind of loose diagrammatic sequence. So understanding this kind of pie chart or flows of materials through space. So just really beautifully rendered and drawn. This is probably that's more than what's expected of you here. I think she used a lot of like 3D models from the SketchUp warehouse too. So definitely check those out. If you ever need a 3D model of a train or a crane even, there's lots of really good stuff on the internet. And then here's an example of how you can use the same kind of graphic or visual language across 3 different views or diagrams. So in this material, this view, she's looking at cement and concrete. She's using the same visual and graphic language in this next drawing here to describe glass. So very consistent representational style, using that same kind of pie chart view of a life cycle of a material flow. And then using really consistent and rigid kind of axo views of what she's drawing here to make sure it's super clear exactly what you're looking at in a very quick glance. It's just very kind to like draw something consistently from the same viewpoint for somebody who's looking at it fresh, because you're like, okay, I understand how I'm supposed to be viewing this thing from, takes kind of some of the mental load off. So very, very consistent graphic language here. I think she had a 4 or 5 year degree in graphic design and architecture, so she's super talented. Anyway, just a really nice example if you're curious. So that's one way of looking at diagramming. Here is another one. So kind of similar. They went for a similar kind of like circular life cycle style, diagram here. So they've got kind of like, this one's more loosey-goosey. Also studying the nature of, I think, concrete. So they've kind of abstracted the life cycle of concrete and these different materials into this kind of spiraling pie chart. So this is also a diagram, and is something that's very easy to understand at first glance, is graphically considered and starts to reflect the nature of the material in the representation. So this one's really lovely, very clean and easy to look at and easy to understand. There's a different diagram for a different material from the same student. So this one looking at steel instead. So again, the graphic language between these two is really consistent. So it's very easy to compare and contrast, as your English teachers might have you do. So definitely something to keep in mind is a really consistent kind of graphic language. Font, size of font, and line weight are really good to keep consistent across all of your drawings. Here is another one. So this one is another one that's starting to implement, the use of AXO. So again, this is just looking at materials. So they're following the life of a tree as it gets turned into a stick frame house. So using kind of light lines to guide you through this image and guide your eye through the different kind of stages of the life of this tree. And then using that really consistent axonometric view so that you're always kind of looking at things from the same viewpoint. And axonometric always feels like a little bit objective, like you're kind of removed from the scene. Sometimes they're kind of scaleless. And so an axonometric is always great to use when you're talking about something from a little bit more of a zoomed out lens. It's not so much the experience of a space. It's about kind of like, okay, what are we talking about here at a bigger scale? So this is another great example where they've used very consistent graphic language, very consistent line weights, and lots of 3D models from the SketchUp warehouse, I think. They definitely did not model this stuff. So anyway, fun, hot tips if you ever need industrial things. But very beautiful and very clear graphic language. Again, this is kind of like top marks from very experienced students. So don't worry about replicating that. This is another example that starts to move away from axonometric a little bit and mixes up a few different viewpoints. So we've got a few axos in here. We've got a little section. And this is kind of reminiscent of that Handbook of Tyranny diagram. So sequences and flows through a space kind of abstracted down to these little moments and flows and systems. So these are very, very beautiful drawings as well. They've done a great job of paying attention to line weights here. So they've really kind of taken advantage of how clean something looks when you draw like a slightly thicker line around the outside of something that you're drawing in AXO. So you can see this little, whatever this is, a little concrete mixer, I don't know. Anyway, there's like a slightly dark line around this object here, and it just makes it read as an object in AXO view. It's just like a little graphic trick to make your drawings look like really good when you didn't do any work. So try that out on your drawings, see if it looks good. But great attention to line weights, great graphic control and layout here. So this is a lovely example. Very beautiful drawings. This is another type of diagram. So this one's starting to look at different materials in terms of energy intensity, I think was the deal with this. So they've kind of turned this drawing or sequence of drawings into kind of like a bar graph, which is really great. So there's kind of like scale of information here. So the thickness of this kind of brown line correlates to the energy intensity as we move from left to right. So that's a really great way to make sure that a consistent scale can start to be implemented in your diagrams to add more kind of technical information. And there's also just like a very beautiful graphic style. So I think they used Illustrator for this one. I'll pop back into Illustrator at the end of class just to show a few more things I didn't get the chance to touch on. But this kind of like visual language is coming from the image trace function in Illustrator, which we'll spend 1 second talking about later. This one is a great example of what you might be interested in doing for your axonometric deliverable here. So this one, again, from super strong, very experienced student. They kind of abstracted their diagram into just like one big long image where the process flows of these different materials move from top to bottom. So very beautiful and well drawn in Illustrator from what I understand. Again, just committing to a very consistent axonometric viewpoint. So everything is seen from this kind of quote unquote objective angle, but really fun, playful use of color and diagrams to talk about material flows. This is another strong one. This one's just kind of like more infographic style. That's something you can pursue if you're interested in just communicating information about whatever means something to you. This one's maybe a little bit more like, yeah, infographic data driven than most people's. This is another cute little sequence. So again, starting to use some axonometric representation, but it's not totally rigid. And mixing that in with other kind of viewpoints to, again, just describe material flows. These ones were, I think these ones got like slightly less high grades, partially from their kind of like inconsistent graphic styles or like not super clear graphics, as well as just kind of organizational clarity. So this one, I think there's really great ideas. It's just a little bit trickier to read with the color choices, and your eye kind of like doesn't necessarily know where to go with these kinds of images. So really strong ideas and concepts, and like this one is actually very clear, but the graphic language is a little bit tricky and dominant to read. It makes it hard to like understand what you're looking at sometimes. This one, this is an example where like actually it's very clear and very easy to understand what you're looking at here in this sequence, but just could use a little bit more love to communicate a little bit more information. Like this is very simplified. And simplification is great. I think a big part of diagramming is editing information down to only what you need. But this one edits maybe like a little bit too much. Like it's hard to know what you're looking at exactly until you start reading the text. So always try to think about like, is there a way for me to draw a diagram that doesn't need people to literally read the text to know exactly what you're talking about? Anytime you're relying on text to kind of communicate what you're discussing, that's just kind of another level or layer of like, oh shit, maybe I need to communicate a little bit more information visually rather than in text format. So very clear sequences, but just maybe could use a little bit more loving to rely a little bit less on the text in the sequence here. Oh, this is another one that was high marks. This is an example where they've started to mix in hand drawing. They hated Illustrator from what I remember. So they did like a little bit of work in Illustrator with these photographs and then added in some fun kind of hand drawings to make a fun kind of sequence that's pretty easy to follow. This one was this one was like a high medium grade from what I remember. So it's another kind of sequential diagram following the life of a material. Very clear, nice use of color and very well edited. The only note was, I think, again, it's just like visually a little bit more tricky to kind of track the flow through the drawing. Like the use of color and arrows is well done. I think maybe there's just like one more layer of editing that could make it a little bit easier to follow the sequence through the drawing. Sometimes when you're asking the viewer to move their eyes in this kind of like serpentine crisscross way, it can get a little bit easy to get lost visually. So keeping an eye on how you're asking people to move their eyes across an image is a good thing to pay attention to. This one used kind of like abstract collage style stuff. And I think that's admirable. I think in this case, maybe there's like, I don't trust the information that they're conveying in the background here. I don't believe that that means anything. So anyway, just lending a level of kind of rigor to the drawings, like maybe adding something like, actually in this case, adding a little bit of text might help clarify what exactly we're looking at in this scenario. They're charting different, I'm not sure, it must have been energy intensities or something. So it's just like a little bit more graphically demanding to look at, and also a little less clear what exactly we're supposed to get from these drawings and sequences. And then this is one more, actually, this one's pretty good, I think. There is some good clarity here in what we're supposed to understand moving from left to right. I think, again, it was just like a little bit of a lack of rigor in terms of like, what does this wavy line mean? I don't trust that that actually means anything. So if you're going to include kind of like scalar information, just being a little bit more rigorous and drawing it in such a way that it makes me want to trust you and trust what you've drawn. So some other good examples, some little kind of axo views mixed in with different types of views. This is image tracing. We'll talk about that in a second. This kind of like loopy effect. We clearly showed them image tracing the week before this deadline. So as I will to you. Okay, so those are student examples. I'll also show you some examples from when I was a student, also of diagrams. I love diagrams. I did a lot of diagrams when I was in school, and they're just like slightly different examples. So I think these are all from my thesis. So I did these in my last year of school. And you can use a diagram for almost anything to convey any type of information. In this one, I was talking about kind of time and spatial relationships of when artifacts were found at a specific site that I was really interested in. So this is almost kind of like a section view cut into the ground, relating to like this little section drawing I had earlier. So pairing more architectural drawings like a section with more loosey-goosey diagrammatic drawings like these can be quite productive. And mixing in just kind of like minimal text to describe dates or times on top of those kind of spatial relationships can be productive. I also had diagrams like these. So this is kind of a sequence or assembly diagram. So exploring the construction of a specific culture's teepee and how that relates in kind of both a plan view and an axonometric view. Using consistent labeling can be really helpful to help orient the viewer when they're trying to understand the same object from different spatial perspectives. So little ABC labels can be useful as well. And never forget the value of a dashed line. A dashed line can suggest or imply a lot, which is really great. And using just like a consistent perspective is really helpful as well. So again, just picking one viewpoint, maybe an axon, maybe not, and sticking to it can help make it a lot clearer what you're talking about as you move through a sequence of images. I did a few Bjarke-Ingels style diagrams. So A plus B equals C. This was quite helpful. So this is also using like an axo chunk of the ground. A plus B equals C. People love that shit. And another example of like spatial or scalar diagrams here. So these diagrams are comparing just the amount of land that could be worked in a day per person. So comparing and contrasting scales. So back in the 20s, each person could do this tiny little white rectangles amount of land. And now when I was working on my thesis, one person could cover this big white rectangle with a machine. I was really interested in machines. So I have lots of machine style diagrams, but here's another example of kind of mixing a consistent axonometric viewpoint. So I had this kind of axo view of a combine that I downloaded from the SketchUp warehouse, which was really great, mixed with these kind of photographic studies of motion of like a human arm. So comparing human motion to machinic motion, side-by-side comparison was really helpful for me. And then using consistent viewpoints for that machine. And then just working with photographs for the human motion. Found that one really productive. So those are diagrams. When in doubt, Google Bjarke-Ingels and just do whatever is going on here. But the world is your oyster, truly, when you're working with diagramming. There's very few constraints. Again, we're just asking for two 11 by 17s, one that is kind of, either 3 separate diagrams or a sequence of diagrams, and then another 11 by 17 that is some sort of axonometric drawing. So that can be axos like this. It can also be something like, I would definitely take a look at Dogma's axonometrics. So they do a really great job of doing kind of large scale axonometric work. So they have very beautiful kind of black and white line weight drawings of these axonometric views of a building or a project in its larger urban context. So I would definitely take a look at some of these drawings. They're really beautiful. And obviously like beyond the scope of what we're asking you to do in this class, but just some nice little inspo for what you might do for that second 11 by 17. Okay, is that clear? We're doing okay? Any questions? So far, so good. Okay. So hopefully I'm going to keep class pretty quick today. I think we had you penciled in for a work session. We might have to push that off. But there's just 1 or 2 more things I wanted to cover in both Photoshop and Illustrator. The first of them, I think I'm going to start in Photoshop, and we're just going to talk about the AI properties that are in Photoshop now because they are crazy and they're getting better every day. So I'm just going to open up Photoshop and show you something I did the other day that kind of freaked me out a little bit, how good it was. You don't have to open this up or follow along. I'm just going to show you some scary stuff and maybe it'll stick with you. So we had a rendering in our office that Henry did, and it looks very pretty, and it's for a nice cultural center up in the Yukon. And we ultimately needed like a poster. So he did this nice little landscape style 11 by 17 rendering. And it's like, okay, great job, Henry. But now I need a view that's like this tall. So I needed to fill an 11 by 17 to make a poster out of it. And I could have just like zoomed this in until we got to like here, but that's not really saying much about the project. And he'd done so much nice work to capture all this extra stuff. So instead I tried using the Photoshop AI, and let me tell you, I was shocked and amazed. I've been using it since it came out, and I was using the little beta version, and initially it wasn't very impressive at all. And you would try to add a dog into your rendering or whatever, and it would bring up like Satan's beast and like stick it into your rendering. So it wasn't very impressive at first, but I don't know, lately it's like, I think it's picking up speed, and it learns the more people that use it. So it can and will be getting better. So definitely keep your eyes peeled on things like Photoshop AI. So to use it, it's very easy. I think it's baked into default Photoshop now. So this should show up for you anytime you open up Photoshop if you have an up-to-date 2024 Creative Cloud, whatever. I think it's getting harder and harder to use like cracked versions of Photoshop. So you're probably kind of stuck using this anyway. But it's very innocuously kind of baked into the program now. So let's say I wanted to expand the sky up here. I want to expand this image. I can just select the empty area that I want to fill in. So I'll use my little marquee tool, my little rectangular selection device up here. I just grab a little bit of like overlap with the image below. And now you can see there's a little bar that pops up, which you can kind of like click and drag around if you want. And there's a button here that says generative fill. So this is the AI properties in Photoshop now. So if I type in generative fill, you can give it some text if you want. I've had limited good results with the text function so far. I haven't played around with it too much. I've mostly just been like blown away by the capacity for it to fill in or take away information without any kind of like text prompt. So if you just leave this empty, which is something you can absolutely do, and just hit generate, it's going to generate, it's going to chug away. And it's going to come up with some options over on the right-hand side for me of what it thinks should go in that space. I'm hoping it's going to do a good job because it did an amazing job the other day. Obviously, the bigger the area, the more time it's going to take. Okay, this one doesn't even like look that good. The one that it gave me the other day was crazy, but you can see it's produced a couple of different variations down in the bottom right-hand corner here. So you can click through and change the different options. This one doesn't even like look amazing. I will see if I can open the one I recently did. Oh, damn. Okay, maybe not. Anyway, so I'm just kind of like, Jesus, that's amazing. Because this is the kind of thing that would like take you a lot of time to produce. I can do some stuff down here too. I can fill in the ground a little bit. So again, just select a rectangle. I've been clicking on the layer that I'm interested in expanding. I've been told that it understands everything beneath what you have selected. So if I had layers underneath this, it would reference them and try to match them as well. So again, I can just put in generative fill, generate. You can see it makes a new layer here, generative fill too. And now it's filled in that ground for me, which is like crazy. It looks so good. Again, you can scroll down. It makes a couple options for you. Some are better than others. But like, that is wild to me. I've also found it super useful for editing existing images. It's mostly best for like taking things out or removing things as far as I can tell. So like if I wanted to get rid of this crazy lady staring at the wall, that's very easy for me to do with the AI. So I can just like, again, grab a little rectangle and grab her and what she's sitting on. Type generative fill. Again, like don't type in anything. And it'll try and like fill in the blanks with what it thinks is appropriate. Boop. Bing bong. That's crazy. That would have taken me so long back in the day. So, and again, yeah, you can like, there's different options it gives you. You can keep running. Like if you press generate again, it'll just generate more variations for you, which is wild. So anyway, just know that that's a tool. If you ever need to remove something from an image, it's very powerful. It's still not amazing at generating stuff. Maybe I'll try and generate a dog and see if it brings me Satan's hound. Dog sitting. If you've ever used anything like Midjourney, it's very similar, like prompt language. I'm scared. Oh, look at him. Cute. Oh. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. And it doesn't like match the image super well, unfortunately, in these examples. So the generative stuff isn't like amazing, but I would leave him in. He's cute. Look at that. You got a big ass tail. Yeah, so that's, I just wanted to mention that the power exists. I would definitely keep your eyes peeled on it. It's going to change faster than we can keep up with. So keep your eyes peeled. I also just wanted to mention one more thing about Photoshop. So, and that's just kind of like brightening images, changing the brightness and darkness and saturation and stuff of images in Photoshop, because I don't think I got to that. The best way that I've found to do it, you can change the brightness of individual layers one at a time. You can edit them like that. I don't like doing that in general. I prefer to add in a new layer that lets you control kind of everything that's underneath that layer. So my favorite way to play with the brightness and darkness of an image is to come up to layer, new adjustment layer. So adjustment layers are what I like to use to change the way an image looks underneath. And then my favorite thing is curves. So layer, new adjustment layer, curves. It'll give you some options to name it. I'll just hit OK. You can see now it's made a new curves layer for me down here. It's sitting on top of everything, so everything that's underneath it will be affected. And there's this like funky little UI over on the right hand side. By default, it'll just be a straight line. What these little, this kind of like pale bar graph underneath is representing is the brightness values, I think, from what I understand, of the image underneath. So if you start pushing and pulling that line, it'll let you push and pull the brightness of your high and low values. So I'll usually just add a point and click and drag it up. And then add another point down here and click and drag it down. Usually if you make like a little bit of an S curve with this bad boy, you can start to get some interesting results. It's just like a very intuitive and easy way to control how your image is looking. I would recommend you play around with it a little bit. You'll get the hang of it very quickly. Much easier to use than like numerical values, in my opinion. So I like curves. Curves is a really good one. There's also other types of adjustment layers like brightness and contrast. So this one, again, it'll just give you 2 sliders. You can brighten it up, increase the contrast. And again, this is like a non-destructive workflow, so I can always just turn this off if I don't like it, which is great. I like being able to undo things like that. So this might be a way that I start to add in this dog in a way that fits in a little bit better. I can take my little curves layer that I've created and drag it down. So it's sitting just on top of kind of dog. You can see it's affecting everything that's underneath it, so that those kind of brightness adjustments that I've made, they kind of run out because they're only sitting on top of my little freaky dog and this initial image that I'd created. If I'm interested in having this curves adjustment apply only to my freaky little dog, if you hover over it, so if you hover over this curves layer and press either Alt on a PC or Option on a Mac, so Alt on PC, Option on a Mac, you can see I get this weird little, my mouse, my little cursor turns into a weird square shape with a little down arrow next to it. So again, that's just by hovering over the edge here and then pressing Option or Alt. And when you do that, suddenly now it's just applying this adjustment layer to what's exactly below it. So now this is only working with this dog. So you can see those brightness adjustments are only, oops, sorry, Jesus, relative to my freaky little dog guy. So I can go back in, I can play with those until he's like a color that makes sense. But you can see the generative AI stuff, it didn't just give me like a little dog, it also influenced the environment around it. So it's also producing this rectangle of information as well on top. So that's something I could play around with. I could also kind of like select my little dog here. So I could use the quick selection tool, my little favorite. Oops, too big. And select this fella. Maybe not. Anyway, it'll be picky. You can crop out this little guy. Beep, boop, boop. And his big ass tail. And you can either put a mask on him. So again, just kind of hover over this little layer mask option down in the bottom right-hand corner. And press layer mask so that it kind of like crops him to that little shape. Or I can actually kind of like use that on my curves layer. So you can see there's also a mask on this brightness value. So I've made this brighter on the curves layer. I can also paint out what I'm not interested in on this curves layer as well. So if I've selected my dog, I can go back in and kind of paint out everything that's outside of him on my curves layer. So now it's only bright. The sun only shines on this little boy, which is great. I'll also mention if you have a brush in Photoshop and you're like painting on things with a brush. So if I was on a normal layer and I was using the brush tool here and painting with it, sometimes it's really annoying to change the size of the brush to like come up to the top here and change the size and hardness up at the top. So a nice little shortcut to change the size of the brush while you're working. On a Mac, it's Control Option click. On a PC, I don't remember, Google it. I think it is Control Alt and then click and drag. So by dragging left to right with your mouse while you're holding down Control and then Option, that lets you change the size. If you click and drag your mouse up and down, that lets you change the hardness or the kind of fall off on that brush there. So just by moving your mouse in 2 different directions, you can change the size. That will save you a lot of time, I promise you. Okay, I'm gonna say goodbye to this little fella. He was great. Any questions about Photoshop, Photoshop AI, or adjustment layers? Yeah, cool. Keep your eyes peeled on this technology. It will take your job. So I'm gonna pop into Illustrator quick, and then similarly, just gonna talk about some things that are like kind of new in Illustrator that I think are worthwhile keeping an eye on. Illustrator also has some new funky AI features. They're not as good yet as the Photoshop stuff, but there is like a generative, I closed it, so I don't know where it went. Anyway, there is like a generative feature. Oh, here it is. Text to vector graphic in brackets, beta. Beta means bad still. So it's not amazing at this point. But you can type in text stuff if you want to generate, like, let's try to generate a dog sitting again and see what it does. So I can type that into this little prompt window here on the right-hand side. Type in generate. It's going to think for a while. I haven't played around with this one so much, so I don't know what the different settings do so much. This doesn't look good. I'm scared. Oh, look at that. That's not bad. Look at this little guy. He's cute. Oh, I give him my lunch money. So there's, I don't know, things are changing very, very quickly. Keep an eye on that. Test it out if you're interested. Again, that's just cooked into Illustrator now. It's just sitting on the right-hand side in your properties window. So play around with that. Don't waste too much time on it if you're struggling. But anyway, interesting technology on the rise. Lots of little AI dogs coming to a city near you. The other thing I wanted to talk about was actually the 3D and materials properties that are kind of relatively new in Illustrator in the past year or two. So this is a window that you'll have to kind of turn on. I'm not sure it'll be on by default for you. So you might just have to come up to window and then just make sure that 3D and materials is checked. And I used this to make all of these diagrams for work a couple months ago. Like, these look a little bit 3D and they have 3D shadows and stuff, but I did them all in Illustrator using this 3D and materials capacity. And it's very cool and a little spooky. So I'll just come up into empty space and show you how you can do it. So you can draw whatever you want. I'll draw maybe like a little circle, cute, and a little rectangle. Great. And I'll make them, maybe I'll make them white. And then I'll make them one shape. So I'll come down to Pathfinder and like union them together. Click to unite. So now I've just got like one shape. Great. So I can come over to my 3D and materials window here. I can select the geometry that I've drawn, and then there's a couple like fascinating options to work with now. So this is brand new. If I type in or click on this plane option here, it'll take my geometry and rotate it so that it's kind of in an axo view, which is really interesting. You can play around with the degree that it's rotated with this X, Y, and Z slider, which is crazy. And you can change the perspective as well. So you can get like fisheye, crazy view, or normal. The extrude capacity is really interesting. So this is just a plain view. It's taken my geometry and kind of warped it so that it's in axo. Extrude is wild because it'll take your geometry and extend it back in space. So if I click on extrude here, and then crank up the depth of my object, it'll thicken it. So Illustrator is Rhino now, apparently. You can have it twist as it moves back in space by clicking this little slider. It's crazy. Or taper. This shit is wild. And you can play around with the materials too. Like, so they're starting to experiment with materiality and like essentially how it's rendering this object. So you can come over to, we were by default in the little object tab here, but if you pop over to materials, there's a few that are like cooked into the software by default from Adobe Substance. Adobe Substance is like another product they're trying to sell you on, so you can play around with that if you're interested in making materials for Illustrator, if that's something you want to do. But I can apply all kinds of crazy shit to my two-dimensional drawing that is now suddenly 3D for some reason. Anyway, I think this is insane, personally. Technology is moving faster than I understand. But it's very cool. So I would highly recommend playing around with this if you're interested. Don't get too lost in the weeds and don't do things to scale in here. Like, don't draft stuff in Illustrator, please. I will come for you because it's not to scale. It's like not measured. You're not doing measured drawings from scratch in Illustrator. The beauty of working with something like Rhino is that it's measured. You know exactly what dimension everything is. Illustrator is not, but this could be super fun for like your diagramming assignment if you don't want to take the time to measure something and you're just talking about an idea instead of a scale. This could be a fun way to go. There's other options. So there is revolve. So this is very similar to the Rhino command revolve. If I click revolve for my little shape that I've drawn, it's going to spin it around until we have like a psycho donut. And I can change the view I've got on it here. So it's taken that shape and twisted it around. And you can play with how much it's twisting it with this revolve angle option here. You can see it started from here. And now it's twisting it all the way around. You can have it twist as it goes. Whoa. I don't understand how Illustrator has the computing power to do this, but it's very, very interesting. That's another option. Inflate is also very fun. So this will take your flat shape and make it thick, which is fun. You can inflate both sides. So you've got a nice little pillow shape. You can choose how much it's inflating it. Anyway, this stuff is nuts and very cool. You can also change the lighting, which is interesting and scary. So again, this stuff is getting better all the time. Like this UI has changed from the last time that I've used it. So it's just fascinating. You can click and drag the light source around, which is wild. Like this looks better than Rhino render already. Don't tell Thomas. Different lighting types. So like diffuse, ambient occlusion style. You can choose consistent lighting. Anyways, shit is crazy. So definitely play around with that. Again, that is the 3D and materials tab. It can apply to anything that you've drawn in 2D. And you can get to that under window and then 3D and materials. I'm just going to touch on one more thing that's like slightly less interesting, because a lot of people used it on their assignment last year, so it clearly resonates with people. And that is image trace. So image trace is a function native to Illustrator. And once you understand how it works, you're going to see it everywhere. It's rampant in society. We're going to use an image. Oh, we're going to use this image. I'm just going to open it in Illustrator and I'll show you what image trace does and how it works. I'm just going to delete my 3D shape now to save my computer. Okay. So image trace is a function in Illustrator that essentially kind of reads each pixel in your JPEG or your PNG or any type of image file that you have. It looks at the RGB values of your little image and it tries to convert it into vector shapes. So an image like this, as you're well aware by now, is made up of little pixels, little dots. And that's great. But after a certain point, sometimes you're like, I want to draw this little puppy with a vector outline or a vector shape that I can work with or manipulate. An image trace is Illustrator's kind of first crack at that. So to get to image trace, it should show up automatically for you under properties. So just under your properties window here, anytime you have like a JPEG or a picture in Illustrator, you should be able to scroll down and see that there's like a little option here that says image trace under quick actions. So right down at the bottom here, you should see something that says image trace. If you don't see it, it's probably because you're not clicking on a picture. So make sure you're clicking on a picture and then it'll give you some options here. So there's also an image trace window. So I can come up to window and then check on image trace, and it'll give me a few more options for while I'm doing this. I will just put it over here. This window is a little overwhelming, and honestly, like, you don't need to work with it at all. So you can just kind of like ignore what's going on here. And just press the image trace button down in the bottom right-hand corner. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit image trace on my little puppy. There's a few different options to choose from here, and I highly encourage you to like play around with all of them. Different results, different options will give you completely different results, depending on what you're looking for. I will do the 16 or 6 colors option first, just so that it's like super clear exactly what we're looking at. So when I click image trace and then hit 6 colors, it's going to scan my image and kind of average out all of the different color values into a maximum of 6 different colors. So it's going to flatten down that image into 6 colors and then group all of the shapes that are the same color. So I'll hit 6 colors here. It'll chug for a while. Depending on the size of your image and how high fidelity you're asking it to go, the longer it's going to take. But now I've got a cute little pic of my puppy, and it's made up of only 6 colors. And the beauty of it, if I kind of click inside of it and keep clicking, is you can ultimately get to like vector shapes. So it groups things together so you don't break them apart, but we're gonna do it anyways. You'll just have to click expand down in the bottom right-hand corner. So I'll hit expand. It's taking all those little shapes and it's exploding them. And now I've got little pieces of my image that are vectorized so that you can click and drag them around. You can work with these shapes. You can edit them. And that's quite nice. And that's something I used a lot actually in my thesis. I ended up using, I ended up using it a lot for drawings of plants that I ended up doing. So I've had a bunch of these little plant drawings down at the back here. And a lot of this was like image trace. So I would image trace it in Illustrator and then like play with the line work a little bit. People ate that shit up. So yeah, play around with it. It can be a really useful tool. Again, the 6 color one isn't super amazing, but you can play around with different options. So there is like a high fidelity photo option, which is kind of fun. So if I hit image trace, high fidelity photo, this will take a lot longer. But it's just going to try and get like a much finer or higher resolution result for you. Still resulting in like vector shapes, which is fun. There we go. So I've got a nice little, oh, it's so cute. If I expand this, you can see that's all of the shapes that it's made for me. So it's not grouping colors quite as nicely as it was before. It's grouping them at a much finer scale, but still giving you like vector shapes, which can be useful. It's also just like a style. Like sometimes people like this kind of cartoon style effect. I would just like use it sparingly because it is a visual language that people are familiar with. So if you do this, people will know what you've done. And don't let the tool control you. You should be in control of the tool. Okay, I think that is all I have for you today. I'm just going to stick around. We've got like 20 minutes or so, so I'll stick around. You're welcome to stick around, and I'll just float around if anybody has questions for their diagramming assignment, or questions about AI, about the future, anxieties. I'll be here. Okay, have a great week. See you on Wednesday.